In this special episode of Democracy and Justice Show, we explore a critical and timely question. If Islamic political parties such as Jamaat Islami led coalition come to power through democratic elections, will the United States work with them? Our guest today is Jon Danilowicz, former U.S. Deputy Ambassador to Bangladesh, who brings decades of diplomatic experience and first-hand insight into U.S. foreign policy, democracy promotion, and global political strategy. We'll discuss how Washington balances democratic principles with geopolitical interest, how the U.S. views political Islam, and what the future may hold for U.S. Bangladesh relations and beyond. Uh, Jon Danilowicz, welcome to Democracy and Justice Show.
Great. Well, thanks. It's great to be back with you.
Yeah. John, I want to start our conversation by playing a record of our conversation, the very you and me, 9 months ago. Let me
Okay.
play that. Uh, just give me a second, John.
Sure.
Religious Democratic Party. What do you think if, since you said you want to give everybody a fair chance, if in the coming elections somehow Jamaat Islam gets the majority of the vote, do you think USA and the West will give Jamaat Islami a chance, or it will be a huge discomfort among these Western countries to see a political party that has an Islamic or religious label on them is now in the verge of ruling, and there will be some uncooperation from the West side?
Yeah, so it's always challenging to answer hypothetical questions.
Yeah.
There's the reality of how Jamaat Islami has performed in previous elections. There have been some polls that have come out that indicate that Jamaat's level of support may currently be higher than it was in the past. And, the sense on the ground from some people I talk to is that there are other kind of data points that support that, although others have questioned whether their support really is as high as indicated in those polls. Again, in a first past the post, system, as in Bangladesh, there's a question on not just the national voting percentage, but constituency by constituency, which candidates will come out first in the election. So there's a lot of factors that will go into this. I think it would surprise most, if not all, observers if Jamaat were to emerge from this election with a majority. Frankly, I think it would surprise Jamaat itself. But ultimately, the decision on how to deal with the elected government in Bangladesh will depend, I think, in large part by how those elections are perceived.
So, John, 9 months ago, when I asked you this question, your response was it will surprise Jamaat's leader itself. I talked to a lot of Jamaat leaders since then. They seem very confident, and a lot of poll nowadays suggest that Jamaat gained a lot of popularity since we last spoke. I also want to show one of your very tweet very recently that caught my eye. Just give me a second when I bring that up. Uh, you are saying in your tweet that I am getting a sense of deja vu as Bangladeshi elites are trying to come to grips with the widely reported rise in support for Bangladesh Jamaat Islami. In many ways, this is a reminiscent of the reaction of US elites to the rise in the support of President Trump. In both cases, there is a lack of focus on the conditions that may have led to this type of seismic political shift. Looks like, John, you are also recognizing the popularity of Jamaat is rising. What happened? What changed your mind? Are you still firmly believing that uh, if Jamaat Islam-led coalition comes into power, that it will be a huge surprise for everyone, or it's getting a reality since you are a very close observer of Bangladesh's political scenario?
Yeah, thanks for that. And it's always helpful and humbling to see one's past words come back. But in this case, to be honest, I think I would stand by just about everything I said in that interview 9 months ago. To react to your comments, first, it's not surprising that politicians from Jamaat would be confident. Um, Politicians are always confident before elections, at least outwardly, even if
Hmm.
inwardly they have doubts. Bangladesh still has a first past the post system, so there's a difference between what the overall popular vote percentage is and how many seats that yields.
Hmm.
One difference from when we talked the last time is the 11 party alliance to include the NCP, which certainly brings a different dimension to the election on February than if there had not been such an alliance. But I still stand by most of what I said, that Jamaat has had a increase in support, and I think that's
Hmm.
been further justified by other polls that have come forward. So I think it's real, and most people acknowledge that it's real.
Hmm.
Still, many people who I greatly respect tell me that it's hard for Jamaat to get to 151 seats, even with the alliance, because
Hmm.
of the way and where Jamaat's support is concentrated. And I've read a number of analyses and listened to a number of interviews from people who I very much respect. So I will still be surprised if Jamaat gets a majority or if the alliance gets a majority. I won't be
Hmm.
shocked, but I'll be surprised.
Yeah.
Um, Now, on the second part of it, though, and the second tweet, again, I was trying to convey something a little bit different. And again, I stand by what I wrote just a few days back. I remember in the United States how much of a meltdown many elites had when President Trump's support translated into his victory. And
Hmm.
everyone focused on President Trump and they focused on kind of the rhetoric and the kind of atmospherics. But what fewer people did is actually drill down and look at why the American voters had turned to President Trump.
Hmm.
And what many people didn't acknowledge, and frankly, some still don't, is that there were real reasons behind Donald Trump's rise. It wasn't just that he was a charismatic television personality.
Hmm.
It wasn't just because of his policies on certain issues, but it was
Hmm.
that he tapped into something very deep and profound that had changed in the United States in recent years.
Hmm.
So I guess what I would say in terms of the parallel is
Hmm.
that a lot of my Bangladeshi friends, again, and most of the people I know are members of the elite, whether they're in Bangladesh or outside. Even though I've
Hmm.
traveled around the country, I can't pretend to have my finger on the pulse of what's happening in rural Bangladesh. But
Well,
again, from what
what happened to you learning Bengali? Let me remind you, in
I can still speak some Bangla.
in 2009, when I met you first time, believe in an event in Dhaka. I
Yeah.
forgot what that was. You were sitting right next to me. You asked me a question in Bengali, which surprised me a lot. What
Yeah.
happened to that process?
So my Bangla is still there, and in fact, over the last few months, it's probably gotten a little bit better, at least in terms of my comprehension skills. But what I would say, and I've traveled a little bit about Bangladesh, but on my two most recent visits, I didn't, make it out of Dhaka, although I did get out of Gulshan. But I guess my point is that if in fact the change in politics in Bangladesh is real, and if this is translated into more votes, more seats, and potentially even a government for Jamaat, it's going to
Mm-hmm.
be because the Bangladeshi people are looking for something very different from what they've gotten in the past from traditional politicians.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be motivated solely because of Jamaat's platform, manifesto, its religious identity. It's going to be
Mm-hmm.
because, frankly, the people of Bangladesh want a fundamental change,
Mm-hmm.
and that what Jamaat more than anything else will do, along with the NCP, is represent that change. And the idea of the people of Bangladesh have given the Awami League and the BNP multiple opportunities.
Hmm.
They are dissatisfied with what has happened. So now they're ready to try something different. So again, I think that's the parallel. And it's not unique to Bangladesh and the United States. I mean, there have been similar phenomenon in other countries as well. So this is a global
Hmm.
phenomenon of populism, perhaps, that's manifesting itself in both Bangladesh and the United States.
Right. So, if I understand correctly, in your point of view, if a Jamaat-led coalition comes into power, it's the broken-hearted Bangladeshi who didn't get much from the traditional political parties last 50 plus year. So they want to try something new. And Jamaat never been in power. NCP is a newly formed political party who has huge promises from July uprising. So that's what is lucrative for the young voters. That's what you were indicating.
Well, that is certainly one factor. Another factor, I think, would be the desire for clean and honest government. Again,
Mhm.
this is I'm not here as a spokesperson for Jamaat, but certainly one of the things that Jamaat's leadership and candidates have stressed is clean government, and they've
Mhm.
pointed to their past record and they've made promises about the future. There have been similar promises from the BNP and from other parties as well.
Mhm.
But I think if in fact people shift to Jamaat, that may be one of the reasons. It's unfortunate that, as far as I'm aware, nobody in Bangladesh is doing exit polling. In the United States, after an election, you have exit polls, which um, help people understand why voters voted in the way they did. So in this case, we'll have to, I think, just make suppositions rather than have any firm data to go on, unless there's polling done subsequently after the election.
Right. Um, um, uh, I don't know what that is. A very recent poll shows that Jamaat candidates in many of the election areas are doing really very well. Inspired from that, to try to tap into what's really happening, I tried to run a online poll from my show,
Hmm.
and let me show you the result out of it. And then I have a very burning question for you. Pardon my hesitation with this. My editor is not in the
Yeah, no
back
worries.
of this. Yeah, so I just have to find it. It's out somewhere. Here it is. So this poll I had to conduct in Bengali. I'm telling you what that is. I am asking the my viewers, uh, on the day of election, 12th, which of this political
Hmm.
coalition, BNP versus Jamaat, will win? And I'm telling in the bracket that I'm not asking you what political party do you support. I'm
Yeah,
asking
yeah,
you what do you think will win. And the
yeah,
top one is BNP, only
yeah.
16%, and Jamaat and NCP coalition is 84%. And 2,000, over 2,000 people,
Hmm.
2,100 somewhat people participated in this poll. It's not a bot ID.
Right.
We saw that it grow over the time, so it's not that one shot somebody did it. Um, and most of the polls are indicating that Jamaat will really trying to fight a lot. Do you think it's just an online bubble that Jamaat's activists, they are so active on online, which is a complaint from the
Hmm.
BNP side I heard
Hmm.
often. So active in online, but that really doesn't represent the field reality?
So, it's a cliche, but it's true. The only poll that matters is the one that happens on election day.
Right.
There have been a lot of surveys, a lot of polls that have been published in Bangladesh, some better, some worse. There's still a lot of skepticism in Bangladesh about polls. But I've seen enough what I think are credible, serious polls, surveys, that there has been some convergence. Now, there have also been some outliers, those that are clearly partisan. And then, the other issue is people willingly or unwillingly misinterpret the polls. And I'll give you an example on that. The Pro Tamalo survey, there was a question about whether the Awami League should be allowed to participate.
Mhm.
Some people have interpreted those results to say 69% of the Bangladeshi people want the Awami League to participate. That's not what
Mhm.
the poll said. The question, the way it was framed, was under what circumstances would you support the Awami League participating? And
Right.
overwhelmingly, the answer was an unreformed Awami League, an unrepentant Awami League should not be allowed to participate. However, under certain conditions, we would think that they should participate. So this is the problem. So with polls, there's the scientific nature of the poll, the survey size, et cetera, the margin for error. The other thing is how the questions are phrased. And then there's the issue of interpreting the polls. And then the final thing I would say about polls, and this is, I think, the biggest challenge in Bangladesh, is that all
Hmm.
of the polls I've seen have just asked that kind of broad question of who do you support or who do you think you would win? And
Hmm.
that doesn't really translate into 300 different constituencies. I haven't seen any surveys or any polls that are conducted on a constituency basis to say, in these constituencies, here's who's winning, who's losing. Because what could happen, as you well know, is that
Yeah.
one party may be overwhelmingly popular in one area, and that skews the overall numbers.
Hmm.
So in the past, there have been plenty of examples where the popular vote difference in Bangladesh elections has not been that great, but the number of seats that are yielded varies significantly. So that I think is the issue to watch, and I think that is the barrier that Jamaat has to overcome. The final thing I would say on this, though, is we're focusing now on whether Jamaat can win the election. That's a very different conversation than anyone thought we would have. Certainly, August 5th, 2024, or even until recently. Um,
Hmm.
it seems what most people believe that regardless of whether or not they form a majority or form a government, that this will be Jamaat's best showing ever electorally, both in terms of
It is.
percentage vote and number of seats. Now, that could be an outlier because of the factors related to this election, but even so, that would be a significant achievement. And then again, sorry, the final thing I'll say is that in a
Yes.
parliamentary system, the government is obviously important, but the opposition is very important too. I mean, the opposition has a very defined constitutional role in a parliamentary system. The leader of
Hmm.
the opposition has a defined role. And some
Yeah.
of the reforms that the parties have all agreed to include, for example, letting opposition members of parliament chair standing committees in parliament. So, regardless of whether or not the Jamaat forms the government, the Jamaat will be an important factor in the post February 12th political reality.
Yeah. And you mentioned a very important point, actually, the balances of power. If the July Charter is finally implemented, there will be not a lot of difference between the opposition leader and the ruling parties. And the opposition parties can actually contribute a lot in terms of nation building and participating in the political processes. Let's come to the US side of the thing. You have served. Bangladesh, as well as many other countries, as a ambassador, as a mission lead in different countries. You spent significant time of your career in Bangladesh, stationed in Bangladesh. Help me understand this. Just for hypothetically, if we say that a Islamic political party such as Jamaat and Jamaat-led coalition really wins this election with a free and fair mode, would the US be willing to work with that government?
Yeah. So, again, I think of my career and I think of, my 3 decades in the State Department. I entered the U.S. Foreign Service in 1989. So it was still during the Cold War,
Hmm.
before the Berlin Wall came down. So there were a number of communist countries in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And we worked with those governments in some way, more or less.
Hmm.
There are countries that have non-democratic governments, military governments. There are countries that have democratic governments. We have relations with countries, even if we disagree on things, things that are small or things that are large. There are plenty of countries in the Islamic world that have governments with varying degrees to which, they have adopted Islamic principles in terms of governance, and the United
Hmm.
States has worked with those. During my career in Bangladesh, I was in Bangladesh at the U.S. Embassy during a military government, President Ershad, during
Hmm.
democratically elected governments, during unelected caretaker governments, and during times in which the BMP was in power, the Awami League was in power. and the U.S. worked with all of those governments. So I think the reality is the U.S. will work with whoever is elected in on February 12th, as will all the other countries that have diplomatic relations with Bangladesh. We will agree on issues, I'm sure, with whoever is elected, and we will disagree on issues, and we'll work through our disagreements and we'll build on our agreements. So, the role of a diplomat is, I've always said, kind of twofold. In
Hmm.
the one role, what a diplomat does is communicate the beliefs, the policies of the U.S. government to people in the government in the country in which they're serving and to populations more broadly. So we speak. The other thing we do is we listen and we try to understand the positions of other governments. We try to understand the positions of people in those countries, and we report those back to Washington. So there's kind of a loop here. Policy is made in Washington, it's
Hmm.
implemented in the field. So we, as an embassy, as diplomats, we provide input into foreign policy formulation, and then we implement the policies as they come from Washington. But this is a constantly changing, iterative process in which policies are made, policies are changed, depending on individual circumstances, etc. So I don't have any question or doubts or worries that on February 13th, the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka will be doing anything different than it'll be doing on February 11th or February 12th. They'll be implementing U.S. policy, and they'll be understanding or trying to understand what happens in Bangladesh and conveying that
Hmm.
information back to Washington.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. You mentioned about some communist countries that you worked or the U.S. government worked during even your career. Uh, uh, did U.S. Previously work with any Islamic political parties or governments? Were there any lessons that learned?
Yeah. So again, I mean, what I would say is that there are very few countries in the world with which the United States does not have diplomatic relations or has
How
not
about the
had diplomatic relations.
how about the Taliban government even in Afghanistan right now? Is U.S. Working with them closely? I know that U.S. had a long presence in Afghanistan, uprooting Taliban's. Somehow they are again in the power. What is the condition there now in
Yeah.
terms of
So
the
the U.S.
relationship between these two
Yeah.
countries?
So the U.S. doesn't have a diplomatic presence in Afghanistan right now. I don't
Hmm.
believe that the Taliban government has a diplomatic presence in the United States, but I'm relatively certain that U.S. Representatives and Taliban representatives find opportunities to talk to each other, whether it be in New York or in other settings. Um, Again, the same holds true with the government of Iran. The United States does not have um, formal diplomatic relations. We don't have embassies, but we
Hmm.
have contacts. And in fact, we've reached agreements. So
Right.
what I would say is that there are extreme cases, but just the nature of the government in and of itself, I don't think would be any impediment. And certainly, the Jamaat has been in government as part of a coalition
Hmm.
during the 2001 to 2006 period.
Hmm.
And the U.S. had relationships, with the government at that time. So I don't see why anything different would happen. If the Jamaat and its coalition partners were to form the government after February 12th.
Yeah. John, I'm very interested to know the U.S. view of the Islamic political parties in Bangladesh. We certainly know that Taliban and Jamaat is very two different thing. Jamaat, even asked by some journalists to the Amir, the head of the Jamaat Islam party, they clearly said they are not looking forward to implementing Sharia law in Bangladesh. And very recently, when the opposing parties, the BNP and the coalition, was accusing Jamaat of oppressing women or some hacked tweet and whatnot, thousands of women in Bangladesh came out of the street in the favor of Jamaat, uh, which is not the case in Taliban and this kind of very extremist Islamic groups. I'm very curious to know how US views Jamaat Islam of Bangladesh. Like, is it a moderate Islamic entity? Is it an extremist one? How do you guys see Jamaat Islam?
Yeah. So what I would do though is kind of turn the question around first and think of it from, say, the perspective of a Bangladeshi looking at the United States. So,
Hmm.
John Danilowicz, may be a member of a U.S. political party,
Hmm.
and I may hold certain views. Um, the party itself may hold certain views in its campaigns and its platforms, etc. In the U.S., in different states, the Republican and Democratic Party have policies that manifest themselves differently because of those realities and because of the personalities involved. And then you can roll it up to a national level. You have, again, right now, the Republican Party in power in the United States with the president and the leadership of both houses.
Hmm.
So at the end of the day, in terms of if you are Bangladesh and you're looking at the US, it doesn't really matter what John Danilowicz thinks as a private citizen, as a member of a party. It doesn't even really matter what the party may have put in its party platform. What matters are the policies that are implemented by the government. So that's what I would say. I know many people in Bangladesh who are members of different political parties, including Jamaat, and I've had long
Hmm.
conversations with them. And not surprisingly, um, two different people within a political party may have different views, and I've had those conversations with people.
Hmm.
The parties themselves may have views that are expressed, for example, in the manifestos, which have just come out. But
Hmm.
trying to determine how the U.S. would react to a Jamaat Islami led government is a hypothetical question because A, that government doesn't exist, and B, we don't know what that government would actually do. And I
Hmm.
don't think it's the case that you can simply assume that because something is in a party manifesto or because some member of the party gave a speech or wrote something, that that's what they
Hmm.
would actually do in government. And I think what most politicians and most parties find is it's very different being in government than
Hmm.
running in a campaign or giving speeches or, speaking to somebody off the record. So,
Yeah.
and in one interview I saw the Emir of Jamaat give a very similar answer when asked about some of these questions. That ultimately in Bangladesh, what will happen depends on what the parliament will decide. And for some of these fundamental issues, they would require amending the constitution. You require a two-thirds majority. So
Hmm.
unless Jamaat has a two-thirds majority, they won't be able to do many things unilaterally. They'll have to do things in concert with the opposition. So politics is the art of compromise. So I think from a US perspective, even though I don't speak for the US government, my assumption is that the US would adopt a wait and see attitude. They would know what they've heard from people representing the party. They would
Hmm.
know what they've read in terms of party manifestos and platforms, but they would wait to see what actually happens. And in terms of the dialogue, there would be an opportunity to discuss issues that affected US interests and US relations to perhaps influence those ultimate decisions, just as the same happens in the United States. And the US and Bangladesh each tried to influence each other to advance their interests. And that's, something perfectly understandable and acceptable.
Hmm. Yeah. Let me ask you this. We know that during the 71 war, USA was not in favor of this liberation war. They stand with the Pakistan, the then Pakistan that time. Fast forward today, after 54 years, how important the current state of Bangladesh in the US strategic and regional politics and policy?
So I've said publicly many times that the US was on the wrong side in 1971. But I think you also have to understand what was happening in 1971. I would argue, as somebody who's studied history, that the US acted in a way that it did in 1971, and the US policy was what it was, not because of anything in Bangladesh. This was determined by external factors. It was determined by the Cold War, it was determined by the US competition with the Soviet Union, by the Nixon administration's attempt to open to China as a way of balancing the relationship with the Soviet Union, the role Pakistan was playing in that, the role India was playing globally, and frankly, the people of Bangladesh were collateral damage to a policy which ultimately may have achieved some goals of the Nixon administration in terms of China, but ultimately led to a lot of suffering in Bangladesh. So again, that's the history of it. But I go into that history because I think it also helps explain today. I mean, there are important U.S. government interests in Bangladesh, and there's a thriving people to people relationship, there's an economic relationship, there's a broad based relationship. But
Hmm.
let's, be honest with each other as friends. Um, Bangladesh is not near the top of a priority list of this administration, nor has it been at the top of a priority list of virtually any U.S. administration, other than
Hmm.
perhaps at certain moments when there's, crisis or natural disaster. So the U.S., the Trump administration right now has a lot on its plate. As it's said in its various policy documents, it's focused on the Western Hemisphere. We know there's a huge focus on Middle East peace. There's a focus on ending the war in Ukraine. There's a focus on economics broadly. There's a focus on immigration. There's a focus on China, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
So I don't think that US policymakers, particularly senior policymakers, spend a lot of time thinking about Bangladesh. But we're lucky that we have a dedicated team at the US Embassy in Dhaka and colleagues at the State Department in the South and Central Asia Bureau who do focus on Bangladesh. And it just so happens that tomorrow, our Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, Paul Kapoor, is actually going to be testifying on issues related to South Asia at the Congress. So we'll hear from him directly in terms of U.S. interests and the priority that they're placing on Bangladesh and the other countries in the region.
Yeah. Let's look at this current government, the interim government, Dr. Yunus led interim government. In your point of view, from an experienced diplomat, how did this interim government uh, do in terms of maintaining and improving U.S.-Bangladesh relationship? What are there some of the achievement in your eye?
Sure. So if you look back to prior to July and August 2024, and if you look back to the January 2024 election, the U.S. had accepted the result. The U.S. had advocated for free, fair elections. Those did not take place, but the U.S. made it clear that it would deal with the government of the day, the Awami League government. After July and August, there was this momentous change, and the U.S. Acted quickly after the fact to demonstrate its support for the transition and Bangladesh's democratic journey. And you saw this from the Biden administration, beginning with, Professor Yunus's visit to New York for the UN General Assembly in September of 2024, and throughout the end of that year. And I think the Biden administration and Professor Yunus in the interim government already had a degree of trust based on previous relationships, and were able to build upon that. So that was critical, I think, in that stage when the interim government was trying to stabilize the situation. There was a lot of fear, a lot of concern that after the Trump administration began its second term in January, that
Mhm.
Bangladesh and U.S. relationships would hit a rough patch, in part because of a perception that the Trump administration would be overly deferential to India's interests, and it was well known that India had a different viewpoint towards Bangladesh.
Mhm.
That did not happen. Now, part of that might be because of the dynamic of U.S. India relations, but I give the interim government credit for early on engaging with the Trump administration. In particular, the National Security Advisor, Dr. Khalil Rahman,
Mhm.
was an early and regular visitor to Washington, meeting with people at the State Department, National Security Council, U.S. Trade Representative's office. And early on, I think even more so than other governments, the government of Bangladesh understood the Trump administration's priorities. In
Mhm.
particular, they understood the importance of the economic and trade relationship, and took steps very early on to address U.S. concerns and to begin the dialogue that culminated today, actually, with the signing of a framework agreement on trade between the two countries. So,
Really?
whereas people had thought that the US Bangladesh relationship would be strained, in part because of some of the personal history between Professor Yunus and President Trump, where they haven't always shared the same worldview. But
Mhm.
we can leave that aside. The two governments work closely together. Our embassies in Dhaka and the Bangladesh embassy in Washington were very effective in terms of complementing the work that each other was doing. And there's been a steady stream of U.S. visitors to Dhaka, Bangladeshi visitors to Washington, New York. So again, as the interim government comes to an end and it looks at its successes, I think one of its successes on the foreign policy front has to be the strength of the U.S. Bangladesh relationship, which whatever party or whichever government comes after February 12th will be the beneficiary of.
Yeah. Okay. Great. You mentioned about the India's reaction towards the newly formed interim government back then. Historically, at some point, we know that India requested USA to see Bangladesh in the lens of India, and US somehow adopted that policy. I don't know how true that is. Unofficially, that is the message we have. Uh, Very recently, India withdraw the family members of the Indian diplomats from Bangladesh. My question to you is, what does that really mean? Many suspect this kind of thing happens right before a war breaks out. Do you think that after this election, whatever government forms in Bangladesh, and again, India doesn't like it for whatever reason. Bangladesh is a independent and sovereign country. If anything happen, I know it's a hypothetical question. If anything very hostile behavior happens from India, how US would handle it? Will US stand with the will of Bangladeshi people?
So you've asked several different questions there. So let me try to address them sequentially. Um, First is that the U.S. discusses issues in regions with lots of regional powers. So when I was in Panama, the U.S.
Hmm.
talked with the Panamanian government about what was happening in Colombia, and in Costa Rica, they talked with the Colombian government about what was happening in Panama, etc. So the fact that the U.S. and India talk about Bangladesh, or U.S. and Bangladesh talk about India, is nothing new. Now that said, I mean, in recent years, the U.S. has several U.S. administrations had put a priority on developing relationship with India. And if the Indian government expressed interests or concerns about Bangladesh, I'm sure these were factored into US policy decisions. It wasn't
Hmm.
as simple as the US doing what India said, but certainly US policymakers took into account what they had been hearing from their Indian counterparts. Again,
Hmm.
nothing new there. One difference perhaps in the Trump administration is the America First policy very much looks at relationships on their own, looks at the bilateral relationships. And, again, some people deride these relationships as transactional, but in some ways, it's I think it makes it simpler. The US is looking at its interests, and the country that we're working with is looking at its interests. Now, in terms of the issue of the withdrawal of dependents, I have no idea how the Indian Foreign Service or the Indian system works. What I can say from the US side, that I've been in lots of US embassies where we've had temporary withdrawals of diplomatic staff or family members. And often this can be just something as practical logistic. If you are the chief of mission of an embassy, you're responsible for the family members and the welfare of all of your staff at an embassy. um, if you have family members leave, it simplifies your task. If you have non-essential personnel leave, and
Hmm.
again, we've done this in times of conflict, in times of natural disaster, etc. So I wouldn't read too much into it. Now, I'm sure some countries do this for political reasons, to politically signal. The U.S.
Hmm.
very explicitly does not do that. So the U.S. doesn't withdraw, uproot family members simply to send a political message. But other countries may do that. But in terms of the heart of, I guess, your final question, again, you can't really answer a hypothetical situation.
Hmm.
The U.S. has security arrangements, agreements, alliances with a very small number of countries. Our NATO allies, our some of our Asia Pacific allies, Australia, Japan, etc. Those are solemn commitments that if there is a threat to the security, the U.S. is obligated to respond. Certainly, we don't have any such agreement with Bangladesh. The Trump administration has pursued a non-interventionist foreign policy. So again, I don't think there's a scenario in which the U.S. would use force in a situation like that, which I think is what you're getting at. But
Hmm.
certainly the U.S. Respects the sovereignty of Bangladesh and other countries, and the Trump administration has made it clear that one of its priorities is to promote peace around the world. But again, I think this is a hypothetical question. I don't see a scenario in which there's any kind of conflict to that extent. I mean, I think the relationship with Bangladesh and India is a complicated one, but I think both the Indian government and all of the political parties in Bangladesh have indicated the need for a reset in the relationship after the elections, on different terms, certainly than those that existed before, August 5th of 2024. Um, but I expect that after the election, we'll enter into a period of intense diplomacy, not just between Bangladesh and India, but between Bangladesh and a number of its other partners as the new government seeks to, establish its kind of relationships and implement the policies that it wants to pursue.
Hmm. You mentioned about the politicians, Washington-based policymakers, also considering Indian concerns about Bangladesh sometime. We have observed a great deal of US politicians and policymakers are Indian descent, second generation immigrants from India. When you worked with them, did you see that they somehow in favor of India because of their root, or they take the US interest first? What is your personal observation?
Yeah, so every individual is different, right? And the issues you're talking with are by no means unique to South Asia or Bangladesh or India. I'm of partially Irish heritage. Certainly, there are plenty of Irish American politicians, and
Do you have a lot of soft corner for Irish people, or
so
Ireland
again,
is a
so
country when
so
you make the policies?
So part of my heritage comes from Ireland, part of it comes from Canada, part of it comes from Poland, part of it comes from Belarus. So again, that's part of who I am. But when I'm representing the United States, I'm looking at the interests of the United States, not the interests of Ireland or Canada or France, etc. And my assumption is that those who represent the United States do the same. Now, people have their own backgrounds, experiences. Um, when you look at members of Congress, obviously they have a very different set of issues because they're representing their constituents, and
Mhm,
people have constituents who come with different backgrounds, experiences, interests. Um, so I think it's a mistake to oversimplify that just because somebody is of a certain ethnicity or heritage, that means that they will act in a certain way. I mean, I'm accused of this all the time.
mhm,
People assume that because of my name, or they make an assumption of my faith, or they make an assumption based on, my previous service in the US government, that they know how I think or what I'm going to do. And I can say in my own case, most of the time people who make those assumptions are incorrect. So I try to give other people the benefit of the doubt.
mhm.
I try to look at somebody in their totality, not look at one aspect of who they are, and from that assume that I know how they're going to act or what they're going to believe in a certain circumstance. I've just met far too many people who are much more complicated than the stereotypes would suggest.
Yeah. We are almost at the end of our show. Let me ask you this. Recent years, we have been seeing a rise of Bangladeshi researcher students coming into USA. Many of them are living in USA and becoming a part of the Bangladeshi diaspora in USA. What suggestion you have that the Bangladeshi origin community living in USA, what can they do to strengthen the relationship between Bangladesh and USA for the benefit of the both countries?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you kind of answered your own question, that any relationship, whether it's a relationship between states or a relationship between people, only really works if the interests of both sides are taken into account. Um, there's charity, and in charity, perhaps the person who's providing a donation is doing it out of a sense of altruism. and solely is interested in the well-being of the recipient. Um, but that's not the case in most interpersonal relationships. It's certainly not the country a relationship between states. So I think, somebody who is from Bangladesh, who's in the United States, whether they're here as a student or an immigrant or, they're second or third generation, if they're interested in the relationship between the United States and Bangladesh, they should try to look at both sides of the relationship. And again, I've talked
Mhm.
a few times about trade.
Mhm.
Trade only works if it's mutually beneficial. Um, so everyone wants to maximize their benefit, but they have to realize that it only works if both sides benefit. And again, that I think is true in any relationship. So I think Bangladeshi Americans or Bangladeshis in the United States can play a critically important role in building bridges between our two countries. They can help people in the United States understand Bangladesh better. They can help people in Bangladesh understand the United States better. And mutual understanding, I think, is the basis for a strong relationship. So I would encourage them to be active in the political process in the United States. One
Mhm.
thing that I would say is a caution is that while people keep their ties to their country of origin, at a certain point, I think it becomes counterproductive to overly focus on where you came from and not focus as much on where you've come to. So, for example, with the political process, I know many Bangladeshis in the United States still have an allegiance to a political party in Bangladesh that they may have supported or belonged to in the past. But
Mhm.
if they've come to the United States, I would argue that they're much better off engaging in the US political process
Mhm.
rather than worrying too much about, carrying the flag of their political party that they may have
I don't
belonged to in
I
Bangladesh.
don't know if you know, this is the first time US Bangladeshis were able to vote by mail to the Bangladeshi
Right.
election. This was the first time. That would actually add up some more on the phenomena you're just describing, being so engaged on Bangladesh's politics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think the interim government's effort in this regard I think is important. And it recognizes the contribution of the Bangladeshi diaspora to helping to build Bangladesh, particularly through remittances. And again, there are other countries. I mean, if you are an American citizen of Irish or Italian heritage, under certain circumstances, you can have dual citizenship, and the U.S. is okay with that.
Mhm.
But there's a difference, I think, between exercising a vote and again, pretending that you're still back in Noakhali and you're participating in kind of union
Local
level
politics,
politics.
yeah, yeah.
I think you'd have much more influence, and it would be much more fulfilling if you got involved in the U.S. political system and tried to engage in that way.
Yeah, got the point. Last question, I believe, or one question before the last question. Um, do you have any tips for the whoever forms a new government in terms of the foreign policy priority? What tips you may have from your vast experience in diplomacy? The newly formed government should focus on in terms of foreign policy.
Yeah, so I did kind of a thought exercise on this online, and I asked the question that if you were the new Bangladesh foreign minister after February 12th, where would be the first five capitals you would visit?
Hmm.
And I got a lot of different answers, and then I gave my answer to that. And for me, it was all about economics. So obviously, the U.S. is an important economic partner of Bangladesh. China is an important partner. Japan is an important partner. The European Union is as well. Now, clearly, India is an important economic and political partner as well. But there's also a domestic politics component to foreign relations. And I think, given all that's happened, over the past 18 months or even longer than that, I think U.S. Bangladesh India relations need to happen, I think, at a more deliberate pace. So I think it would be, frankly, a mistake, both from a foreign policy and a domestic politics standpoint, for the new Bangladeshi foreign minister to immediately get on a plane and go to New Delhi. I think
Hmm.
that would send all of the wrong signals. So I think the India relationship can wait. And I would solidify some of these other economic relationships first. before I tackled that, which is going to be a much more challenging issue.
Mhm. All right, here comes my last question. How confident are you observing Bangladesh's elections and politics closely from wherever you are? This election is going to be free and fair.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident. There were worries early on about capacity of the election commission. There were concerns about law and order. Obviously, a lot depends on what happens on election day, but this election has been relatively peaceful. The security forces have deployed. There have been relatively few complaints, and the biggest fear had been that the Awami League and its supporters would try to disrupt the election. And there was obviously the tragic killing of Sharif Osman Hadi.
Mhm.
Whoever was responsible for that was trying to disrupt and derail the democratic transition. But since then, thankfully, there have been no similar incidents. And my expectation is that voters will go to the polls. They'll be able to cast their ballots freely. I was pleased today that the Election Commission changed its mind on its initial decision to ban people from carrying mobile phones within 400
Yeah.
meters of a polling center. I understand the reason why they did this, but in the current environment, I think that was a mistake and caused some concern from people about attempts to manipulate the polls. So
Mhm.
with all of the international domestic election observers, with all the domestic and international media, and with thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of citizen journalists, all with their mobile phones ready to capture any incidents that take place, I'm pretty confident that the election will be free and fair.
And you think the transformation of the power can happen democratically after the election is over?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's been signaling from the leadership of all the political parties that they intend to do that. Look, elections are competitive. A lot gets said during an election, but at the end of the day, the parties contesting in this election have far more in common with each other than they do with those who oppose the democratic process and who were on the other side before, August 5th. And the other reality is that if you look at these last 18 months, the parties that are contesting the elections were all part of a de facto coalition. So
Mhm.
I'm pretty confident that they'll be able to work with each other after the election, including in the parliament where someone will be in government and somebody else will be in opposition.
Well, with that hopeful note, thank you so much, Jon Danilowicz, the former Deputy Ambassador to Bangladesh, for your kind time to our show.
Great. My pleasure.